Welcome to App Stories, a weekly exploration of the world of apps. Today's show is brought to you by Direct Mail and Indeed. I'm John Voorhees, and with me is Federico Vitici. What's going on, Federico?
Hello, John Voorhees. How are you?
I am doing very well, thank you.
What is going on is that I'm trying my best not to leave the house too much.
Oh, no.
which is not really that different than usual. Like I work from home, and so I'm kind of used to spending a lot of time at home. So that's not a major disruption to my routine and to my schedule. And otherwise, I'm just, testing a bunch of different apps, and my home screen is a mess because I've been installing like apps and shortcuts lately.
Oh, really?
I've been trying some new things and looking for ideas about, stuff to write about.
Sure.
Also making plans for future stories about the iPad. So should be a fun month ahead now that we are officially in March. Waiting for Apple to make a decision about WWDC.
Right.
So we'll see what happens.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what goes on there. And I like you, work from home, and I guess it's easy for me to stay inside, but there's something about being told that you should stay inside that makes it harder than just doing your normal routine that keeps you inside most of the time. Well, Federico, I thought that we ought to talk today, and actually you came up with this topic, which is we ought to talk about subscriptions again, because we actually did this way back when in episode 5, which seems like forever ago, because I guess it kind of is forever ago. But a lot has changed in the subscription app scene since then. I think at the time when we did episode 5, it was right about the time that Ulysses had gone subscription.
I think it was before that, actually.
Was it really?
I think Ulysses went so we did that episode in May 2017.
Right.
And if memory serves correctly, I think Ulysses announced the Switch in August 2017.
Oh, that's right. That's right. That was in the summer.
On August 10
really?
of all days. Yeah. But it was right about the time when, was it in 2017 that Apple actually announced subscriptions? Or was it 2016? Maybe it was the year before.
I think it was the year before, but it probably wasn't possible until that fall. So it hadn't been that long,
right?
At that point. And I guess if it wasn't Ulysses, there probably hadn't been a whole lot of big name apps at that point that had gone subscription. And it was an episode what was more about what we anticipated was going to happen than what we knew was going to happen. And now we're nearly 3 years into it. And we've seen a lot of different things happen, not just Ulysses, but a whole bunch of other apps go the subscription route. And it's interesting to see how that's gone, because there are a lot of customers who are unhappy. There are a lot of customers who are happy, and there are developers who kind of run the gamut too. And I thought, I think it'd be really interesting to just kind of walk through some of those and observe, what's been working, what hasn't, and where this might be going in the future.
Yeah, let's take a look at some of these apps that have implemented subscriptions. So I started putting together a list, and it boils down to two main categories and an addendum, if you will. So First, I want to talk about the apps that we've seen switch to subscriptions. So these apps were using a different business model before, and then either when they released a new version or just when they decided to make the switch, they're now using recurring subscriptions on the App Store. You mentioned Ulysses. Ulysses announced they were moving to subscriptions in August 2017. So it's well over 2 years at this point. Drafts from Agile Tortoise very famously moved to a subscription model. And Drafts is now a unified experience across platforms. It's on the iPhone, the iPad, the Apple Watch, and the Mac, and it uses subscriptions to unlock more features for customers. Apollo, the popular and excellent Reddit client by Christian Selig, in the Apollo Ultra version, is also using subscriptions, which is an interesting idea in that the app is not really subscription-based, but the Ultra version takes advantage of that. Fantastical, really the latest example, and really one of the cases of a switch to a subscription that has caused a bit of a controversy with people, has also moved to subscriptions a few weeks ago with Fantastical 3, or the new Fantastical as people call it. Fiery Feeds Really powerful RSS client that we've covered a bunch of times on the site and app stories. Also last year, I believe, switched to a subscription. And this is actually, I don't know what you think, John, but I think Fiery Feeds, this is one of the more difficult categories of apps to justify a subscription, right?
It really is, because the business models for RSS readers kind of run the full gamut. They're all over the place. I mean, you've got free apps like NetNewsWire, which is currently on the Mac and coming soon to iOS. And then you've got apps like Reader that is paid up front, both with separate purchases on the Mac and iOS. And Fiery Feeds is charging a subscription. Now, it's not, one of the most expensive subscriptions I've seen, but when you're competing with paid up front and free, it strikes me that might be a little difficult. But it still remains one of my favorite RSS clients. I keep it installed on my iPhone, and I switch back to it every now and then to see what's going on, because it really has been one of the most innovative RSS readers in the last 2-3 years.
Yeah. In 2018, Castro, the popular podcast client, released version 3. So Castro 3 came out with it had like a redesigned player screen, a new Apple Watch app, but also introduced Castro Plus, which is an optional subscription to get advanced features like trim silence, the voice enhancer, mix to mono chapters, and a bunch of other podcast listening options. Then we have Darkroom, the photo editing app, which is also another recent switch to subscriptions. This happened a couple of weeks ago. Darkroom is now using a subscription on the App Store for new users of the app. And also Weatherline 2, a new version of the popular weather app, which very famously uses this really innovative line view to show you the temperature, like for daily and weekly temperature changes. Weatherline 2 is also based on subscriptions, and we're going to talk about Weatherline 2 in a few minutes again.
Don't forget Overcast, because Marco Arment's premium features are also, removing banner ads and uploading files and having an alternate icon are all part of a subscription model there too.
In addition to apps that have switched to subscriptions, we've also seen a lot of new apps. So apps that did not exist before launch and be based right up front from the first version on a subscription-based model. Some of the highlights that I've collected for this episode include Noto, which is a note-taking app that launched last year, which we recently discovered on the App Store, and Ryan reviewed on Mac Stories. And Noto, if you want to get the premium stuff, it's a subscription. Napbot, which is a sleep tracking utility for iPhone, also launched last year, and the premium version is also a subscription. My favorite example of new apps that are conceived and released and designed around the subscription is Timery for Toggle. So Jory Barr's excellent time tracking utility based on the Toggle API launched last year, and it was based, with the whole Timery Club thing. It's a subscription, and it gives you access to additional features and additional settings for your timers. And I want to mention Flighty. Flighty is a beautiful flight tracking app with a lot of really interesting features for frequent travelers, and it's made by part of the team, Ryan Jones. He also works on Weatherline 2, so he brought some of that knowledge for Weatherline 2 subscriptions to Flighty subscriptions, and Flighty, it's a really good example of a new app that, because of what it does, right, talking to data providers with ongoing costs when it comes to polling data about flights and aircrafts and all kinds of recurring and up-to-date information. Because of that, it needs to use a subscription. And just like Weatherline, and again, we're going to talk about that in a few minutes, but it comes with one of the best sign-up flows that I've seen in terms of subscriptions on iOS. Lastly, I want to mention, this is kind of a different one, BB-Edit, the popular text editor for Mac by Bourbon Software. It came back to the Mac App Store after like a 4-year absence. Right. And when it did, because BB-Edit was pulled from the Mac App Store several years ago, then it came back last year. But it did so with a different version. So if you buy BB Edit from the Bare Bones website, it is still a traditional Mac app that you can try for free and then you can purchase. It's a paid upfront app. But if you get the Mac App Store version, that's a subscription-based one. And you pay annually and you get constant access to BB Edit. So if you want to use BB Edit, but you don't want to purchase that from the developer's website, the Mac App Store version, which returned last year after a long absence, is also based on subscriptions.
Right. And the last category, which isn't really a subscription, but I thought was worth mentioning, is this hybrid model, which I think the best example of it is Agenda, because Agenda is a calendar-based note-taking app that has an in-app purchase that allows you access to all of the new features that are released in a 12-month period. So after the 12-month period is over, though, you don't lose access to those features like you would if a subscription expired. You keep them and you can continue to use them. You just don't get the new features that come out after that point, which I think is a really interesting model. It's not used by a lot of apps at this point. I think maybe it's a little hard to explain to customers, but it is one that I like a lot. Especially, I think it's good for customers who are looking for an app that they want to try out and they want to have access to the latest and greatest, but they also aren't sure whether it's going to be a long-term app that sticks with whatever workflows they have. I think it's good in that sense because it gives you a good, solid, long period of time to try out the app, figure out what it's all about, and decide if it's for you. And even if you don't decide to go forward with it, you still have those existing features which are useful to you, and unlike a subscription where things just kind of go away. This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Direct Mail. If you have a business, I bet you're already on the lookout for ways to build your customer base and your following this year. Well, a super cost-effective way to do that is still email. For over 15 years, Direct Mail for Mac has been the go-to email marketing app for businesses, nonprofits, schools, and other organizations who want to expand their reach and connect with customers. It's designed just for the Mac, so you can get your work done in half the time using those Mac technologies that you've grown to love. Things like drag and drop, keyboard shortcuts, integrations with other apps, and a whole lot more. Direct Mail has eye-catching templates that are infinitely customizable and look great on all devices. Direct Mail also has a helpful customer service staff that's staffed by real humans. There aren't any chatbots or AI. It's just friendly people who want to help you if you need a little help. And there's no extra charge. Send your first campaign today with a free download of Direct Mail. Listeners of this podcast will save 10% off all of their full feature pricing plans. Head on over to directmailmac.com/appstories to experience top-rated email marketing for the Mac and see how they can help your business grow. Again, that URL is directmailmac.com/appstories for 10% off all their full feature plans. Our thanks to Direct Mail for their support of App Stories.
So in this episode, we don't want to talk about, and I think, John, you agree with me, we don't want to talk about the backlash from people and all the drama that happens on Twitter.
Right.
When a new app launches and it's a subscription or they switch to subscriptions. We want to focus on what are some of the best practices if you're a developer and you want to use a subscription? What are some of the strategies that you should follow for a successful launch? But we also want to talk about the future. We want to talk about what does it mean for the App Store economy? But just briefly, I think we should mention and touch upon some of the main problems for users. And this is tricky because, when you're talking from the user's perspective, everyone has different priorities and everyone puts a different price on the importance of a specific app in their workflow. But I think I've identified maybe three main issues. Really, the primary one, which is when I think about it, is really the main problem for a lot of people is when developers switch to a subscription for an existing app and they don't communicate that to customers beforehand. So the unannounced switch, where seemingly out of the blue, an app that you're using as a new version, and the new version suddenly throws up a screen that says, this now requires a subscription. And I think we've seen a lot of examples of apps that have surprised maybe people with this kind of switch. Maybe we've seen Airmail go through a bit of a rough patch in terms of communicating to users that they were now using a subscription for pro features. Fantastical and Darkroom, I've seen some of the comments online, some of the tweets from people, and I think definitely having this kind of transition without people knowing like weeks or months in advance is a bit of a problem for a lot of customers.
It really is, and it's a hard problem for developers to solve though too, because the customers aren't really their customers in the sense that they don't have necessarily the contact information for their customers to let them know. Someone may have signed up for a newsletter, which is great, and they can send out word that way. They can do blog posts. They can, go on Twitter. They can do a lot of things, but inevitably there are going to be some people who are surprised. But minimizing that, I think, goes a long way towards making the transition a little smoother. And I think one company that did a really good job with this recently was MindNote. The MindNote app went subscription, I don't know, what was it, like a month and a half ago. And they had a blog post about 2 months out that explained it all. And they were very open about it and transparent about what was going to cost money and what wasn't. So there was not as much... there weren't as many customers that were upset by that. I think you're inevitably with subscriptions going to upset some people because it really comes down to, I guess, what is kind of your second point on this, which is the too expensive subscription. I mean, you look at it and everybody's price point for an app is different. What's their tolerance for paying for an app? And you can come up with examples that are way off on one end of the spectrum where a lot of people will agree, well, that's just too much money. But there's always going to be someone, even in a range that you or I might find reasonable, who are going to be upset with that price and not willing to pay it. And what I find really interesting about subscriptions, instead of just saying to themselves, well, there are 5 million apps on the App Store. I'm sure that, surely there's an alternative to this one that I'm not willing to pay X dollars for every month. A lot of people just get very, very upset. And, I guess I get that to a degree, especially if it's something that you rely on and you're used to and you don't want to learn a new app. But there are alternatives. And I think that is what, in the end, really keeps the price structure at a level that's reasonable, because, all these developers are facing competition from one another. Nobody can go out there and charge like an exorbitant amount of money without losing too many customers. It's a matter of picking the right price that keeps a critical mass of users happy and using the app so that they can sustain development going forward.
Yeah, and also another problem that I've seen, which is sort of, I think it's hard to identify and to talk about because each app is different, right? But I think I've seen a lot of negative comments whenever some existing features of an app are moved behind a paywall or moved behind a subscription. And so trying to think from the user's perspective, maybe you're using an app on Monday and on Tuesday it gets an update, and that update require like the existing features that you paid for before in the old version are now behind a subscription. And I can imagine how from the perspective of a user, you'd be like, couldn't you just leave me with the old app and the features that I paid for, instead of forcing me to update and requiring me to keep paying a subscription if I want to use the features that I could use just perfectly fine until yesterday. And now, as I mentioned, this is hard to talk about because it involves different apps and it involves different kinds of costs for developers, because this line of thinking only goes so far. It doesn't really address, we mentioned, for example, Weatherline. It doesn't really address apps that maybe you paid for once, but those apps are actually based on features that require ongoing costs. So the line of thinking of saying, but I paid for this before, it doesn't really address the fact that those developers are still paying for ongoing API costs, for example. And so from the user perspective, yes, you paid $5 for these particular features 5 years ago, but now the developer is losing money because you paid once and now the costs are higher than the original price that you paid for several years before. So it's really hard to come up with a single solution for this. But we can share some best practices, maybe.
Yes, and I would also like to add before we do that there are a lot of technical issues here too. It's easy to say, why don't you just do a new app? But when a developer does that, they lose all those reviews.
Yeah.
They lose all those links that were on Mac Stories or wherever else are now dead links. I mean, they're not pointing to the new app, and then there's confusion about having an app with the same name twice in the store, and people getting upset that they maybe download the wrong one, and that it leads to support costs. There's all sorts of behind the scenes issues with this sort of thing. And a lot of it is just because subscriptions haven't been there since the beginning. And so we're still working through this awkward and difficult period of time when it's easier if you have a brand new app like Timery, which you talked about, to bring that over and make that a subscription app from the get-go, because people know that when they download Timery 1.0, that's what they're getting into. But they won't feel the same if it's an app they've been using for 3 or 4 years.
Now, as we mentioned briefly a few minutes ago, one of the if really I think it's the most important factor right now, considering all the stories that we've seen about user backlash and user reactions. I think the most important best practice is to communicate your switch to subscriptions well beforehand, to let people know, offer a roadmap, to let people know, look, we're doing this, it's going to happen in a few months, it's going to happen in a few weeks, and let us explain why we need to do this, and you can decide if the app that you're using is still worth paying for as a subscription. And I think you mentioned MindNode. Really good example, 2 months in advance. Here's a roadmap. Here's what we're going to do. Here's the features that we're going to roll out as part of the new version, which will have a subscription. I also want to mention the Omni Group, because the Omni Group is not new to the idea of roadmaps. Usually at the beginning of the year, the Omni Group CEO, Ken Case, always shares a roadmap for the next year, for the next 12 months ahead, what you're gonna see as a customer coming out, from the Omni Group. But They also did this last year when they announced that OmniFocus, their task manager, was going to use subscriptions, and it was gonna use, maybe it was 2 years ago, and they were gonna roll out a web service, a web app for OmniFocus. And not only did they share a roadmap outlining exactly what was going to happen, but they also launched subscriptions as an optional payment method. So there's plenty of ways you can pay for OmniFocus these days. You can purchase the iOS app and the Mac app the traditional way, but you can also have an optional subscription version, and you actually have multiple layers of subscriptions. You can pay for just the apps on Apple platforms, or you can include the web version as an additional component to that. So lots of pricing flexibility from the Omni Group, and really good job in terms of offering a roadmap and explaining to people why this needs to happen, and giving people choice. I think is also another important factor to consider. Give people multiple options to pay for your product. And I think the Omni Group and MindNode are two really good examples that maybe other developers should take a look at.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think, for the Omni Group, rolling out that web app, I think, was part of the impetus for doing that roadmap and explaining things. Because that helped too, I think, because it's pretty clear when someone's running a major complex web app like that there are costs involved in that. I mean, the Omni Group has lots and lots of customers, and in order to be able to support all those customers on the web, as well as the back end for all of their syncing and all sorts of other things, they need to cover those expenses. And I do think they do an extraordinarily good job of letting people know what they can expect in the coming year, and they pair that message about subscriptions with a here's what it's going to allow us to do for you. It's not just we're switching to subscriptions and here's how much it's going to cost. It's we're switching to subscriptions and here's how it's going to make your life as an Omni customer better, which is the right way to do it.
Another important factor to consider is the ability to sort of grandfather your existing users into at least some of the features that they paid for in the past. A really good example of this, I think, is Weatherline 2. So Weatherline 2, when it came out, to this day, if you download Weatherline 2 from the App Store, as a dedicated screen, so during the onboarding flow at setup, when it's explaining like what are the features that are behind the subscription, it has a dedicated page for old users of the app. And in that page, it explains like, thank you for being a Weatherline 1 customer. And as part of that, we want to offer you the ability to get a year at 50% off. So it's not exactly grandfathering users into existing features as much as it is recognizing existing users and saying thank you and providing an incentive to subscribe to the new version. And that Weatherline 2 page is actually as an explanation from the developers. There's like photos from the two developers. There's their signatures at the bottom of the page. So I think it's really like personal touch, which is really lovely to see in these days from the sort of the indie developer reaching out to customers and explaining why they're using a subscription. And then if you want to take advantage of that offer, you can continue. You can log in with your Apple ID, and the system will see that you actually owned Weatherline 1 before, and it'll offer to subscribe at 50% off, which I think is a really nice way to handle things. Now, I haven't played around with it in a while, but you mentioned, John, that Airmail now has sort of like a similar setting too as well.
They do. They have a setting that you can go to get Airmail Legacy. So if you do not subscribe to their Airmail Pros service, which has the new features in it that came out not too long ago, you can go to the Legacy tab and you can get basically what you had beforehand. Now, there was definitely a lot of the growing pains there when they first launched the new version of Airmail, but I think it's finally settled down and people understand what is part of the deal and what's not part of the deal. And there's an ability to continue using the app in any event, which I think is good. And, I think especially with apps like email and weather, it's particularly important to communicate clearly with customers because people get their iPhones and they expect those kinds of apps to be free because Apple gives them a mail app and a weather app for free already, right? And they don't recognize that Apple's, making up the money they need to run email servers and use APIs for weather data in other places, like the price of the phone. And developers, third-party developers, don't have that advantage. So it's important, especially for less tech-savvy users, to explain to them exactly why it is that this weather app costs money when they can use something that otherwise would be free.
Yeah. And also, of course, we should mention Fantastical 2.
Sure.
If you were a Fantastical 2 user before, all of those features that you paid for, you can still use in Fantastical 3, the new version, even though they would be gated behind a subscription for new customers. And FlexBits, I think, despite some bugs and technical issues that they're now trying to fix, they did this transition and really went way beyond what I was expecting. Like, they can unlock features for you based on the version of the app that you owned. So
right.
They can unlock features whether you use the Mac app or the iPhone app or the iPad version. Really great idea, I think, in terms of being able to grandfather existing users into the features that they paid for before, even though those features are actually part of a subscription now. We mentioned this a few minutes ago, multiple pricing options. And I think this is really important in terms of offering customers that flexibility, that ability to choose. Don't just do like, oh, you need to pay us $25 a year. Of course, you should consider a monthly option that is cheaper and gives people the time to test the app for a month and see if it can work for them. But also, in addition to that, I would suggest consider even more options. Maybe, and I've seen some apps do this, like a lifetime option, like a single, much usually more expensive, but single purchase, paid upfront, lifetime option for those people who really don't like subscriptions, are not interested in paying you $10 a year or $20 a year, maybe you could come up with a lifetime unlock option that maybe costs $50, maybe costs $100, but it's a one-time purchase for people who really don't like the idea of signing up for a recurring payment system. Again, Weatherline as an expensive lifetime unlock option for people who don't want to sign up for a subscription. The OmniFocus has plenty of options depending on the platform that you want to use. And I mentioned BB Edit, which you can get from the developer's website, you can get from the Mac App Store. So I think having more than one option is really important these days for people who maybe don't feel comfortable with just signing up for an entire year.
Right. I really like the lifetime unlock option myself, even though where I've seen it, I've used it once or twice, but not very often myself. I just like knowing that is something that if I decide, oh, this is really, an app that's going to be something I use for the long term, maybe I ought to just invest the full amount now and not have to worry about paying for this every month or every year. I have heard developers have told me they worry about that causing, some paralysis of choice where you're giving customers too many choices and it makes it hard for them to decide which way to go. I see that argument. I still, on balance, think it's better to try to address the people who don't like subscriptions through the lifetime unlock. I've also heard, and this is obviously a very difficult choice to make for developers, which is how much do you charge? And I've heard developers mention to me things like 2 to 3 years worth of subscription pricing is a good number. But then again, that's also one of those things that, especially depending on what your cost structure is for your app, whether it's servers or APIs or whatever it is going to depend a lot and change significantly from app to app. So it's one of those things where I think you just have to kind of think hard about it and get a sense for, especially if you're an existing app, you might have a sense for how long people stick around. And to me, that would be kind of where I would peg it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And of course, offer a free trial for so that people can actually try your subscription app for free. I think free trials are something that we were used to seeing on the Mac in the past, but now whether it's because of free apps within a purchase or subscriptions, I think it's really paramount for developers to say, look, you can try the full thing with no restrictions for a couple of weeks, for a month, and then you can decide. And I think the length of the trial really depends on the kind of app that you're selling and the kind of, how complex it is, how long people should be able to try. But usually, I don't know what you think, John, but usually like a 7-day free trial, when I see that, I always think, man, I wish it was 2 weeks instead of like a week.
Yeah, and I even think 2 weeks is kind of short. I mean, if I'm really, the problem with a really short free trial is that if someone comes to your app and at the time they come to your app, they're super busy, they'll think to themselves, I want to try this app, but if I buy it today, I bet I don't get to it this week, and now now I have to pay. I think you're better off pushing that out to 2 weeks to a month, probably. I know that that's a lot of revenue potentially that you won't get. On the other hand, giving people an option to use the app at more leisurely pace on their own schedule, I think does have benefits because they can dive a little deeper into the app and they can do it when they actually have time to focus on it. This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Indeed. When you start the hiring process, you might have a few questions. Are you going to get good applicants to choose from? How can you narrow down by education and experience? And how will you know when you've made the right hire? Indeed is there to help every step of the way. There are millions of great candidates that use Indeed every day to find their next job opportunity. And you can post a job in just minutes and use screener questions to help you quickly create your short list of applicants. Plus, you can add a skills test to your job post so that you can be confident of your applicant's abilities. There is a library of more than 50 skill tests that range from industry-specific skills like accounting to general aptitude tests like critical thinking. Indeed gives you the smart tools to make hiring decisions quickly and with the confidence that you're making the right hire for your team. Post your job today at Indeed.com/podcast and get a free sponsored job upgrade on your first posting. Again, that URL is Indeed.com/podcast. Terms, conditions, and exclusions apply. This offer is valid through March 31st, 2020. Our thanks to Indeed for their support of the show.
The final thing that I want to mention is I think it's important for developers to make it clear and simple and easy to understand what it is exactly that you're getting in exchange for subscribing. Because to this day in 2020, I still see a bunch of apps display a page that says support indie development and subscribe. Now, you will not find a stronger advocate of indie developers than me. I think I love indie developers and I always wanted to succeed. And I think it's a beautiful thing that anybody in the world can program and make an app and make it available for the entire planet to use. But we gotta be realistic and we need to be pragmatic. And I don't think in 2020, the App Store is 12 years old. I think it's well past the time that we can just ask for money in exchange for good feelings. I think people want to see the value in the money that they're spending, especially now that some people are starting to feel subscription overload. You need to be extremely clear. Look, you're going to give us your money every month or every year. Here's what you're going to get in terms of features. I'm not saying that the emotional component of supporting your favorite indie developers shouldn't be there, but that's something that needs to happen organically. It needs to happen sort of like invisibly within the customer's mind. Sure, I want to support the Omni Group and sure, I want to support Flexibits or the Icon Factory or whatever, but it shouldn't be the primary selling point. It shouldn't be something that you ask for money in return. Does that make sense?
No, it does. And I think the people who are going to buy your app based on those good feelings are already there, that they're already part of the audience and your fans, and that putting it in a special settings page or whatever, like you mentioned, isn't going to convince someone who's coming to the app cold. And I think one thing too, I guess I would raise two additional things. The first is in the release notes of your app, make it crystal clear what is paid and what's free. I mean, if there's a subscription for pro features, I can't tell you, Federico, how many times I've read an app description as I'm working on a review and think to myself, I have no idea which of these things are paid and which aren't. So I uninstall the app so that I'm no longer on the kind of trial subscription. I look at it and then I reinstall it again, and then I have to email the developer. I mean, if I'm doing that, a lot of people are doing that, and I think it pays to be crystal clear in those release notes. So there's a place people can go, not necessarily just on your website, to understand what's going on there. And the other thing I would point to in the discussion about supporting indie developers is that consider the message that sends when you put that in your settings, because to me it sends a mixed message. On the one hand, you're offering a subscription for some set of features. And the reality is, to the customer that comes to that app, the app and those features are either going to be worth that amount of money or they're not. And when you put a message about supporting indie development in the settings, you raise a question in someone's mind as to, well, are these features worth the amount that's being charged, or is part of this really like a Patreon donation or something like that? And that's the problem I have with it too, is that it's not just that the market has changed and moved on, which I agree with 100%, but I think it also potentially sends a mixed message to people about whether your subscription is something they should even consider. And I think making that message as clear and simple as possible goes an awful long way to, succeeding with a subscription.
So I've been thinking about the impact of subscriptions. And I think really the big change that we're going to see is starting this month in March, when 13.4 comes out as iOS and iPadOS and tvOS, and of course the other new versions of macOS and watchOS as well, is the idea of the universal purchase. That means that developers will be able to charge for a single price and allow you to download different apps without having to pay twice. But in terms of subscriptions, that means that Apple will allow developers to check if you've already subscribed for a particular app on one platform. That subscription will grant you essentially a free download or usage of premium features on another platform. This was possible before, but developers had to implement all of these license checking, if you will, manually. Usually there were servers involved, which was a lot of work for developers, especially because of the new GDPR regulations. It's really hard for developers to check all this data without breaking GDPR requirements. And I think we've seen some third-party companies do this for developers. All of this is going to be so much easier for developers because Apple, by doing the universal purchase, will say, you subscribed on the iPhone, well, then you can use the same app on your iPad and the Mac. And really, that's going to be a big change for a lot of developers who use subscriptions.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it opens it up to a lot more people. If developers have an app that's on iOS or iPadOS and on the Mac, and in the past, they haven't wanted to go through what, say, Ulysses did with doing all these servers and receipt checking and all that for all the complicated reasons that you described, that is now going to be built in, and it's going to be so much easier. I mean, there's a reason that third-party companies popped up who were doing this for developers and charging a lot of money for it, and that's because it's hard. And now it's going to be a lot easier. So I think it is going to open things up for a broader spectrum of the developer community, which I think is fantastic. And I think customers at this point, regardless of what you think of subscriptions and regardless of what you think about whether apps should be paid for separately on different platforms, I think the future that we are heading towards is where you're not buying a Mac app or an iOS app, you're just buying an app. You're buying Ulysses or you're buying MindNote or whatever it happens to be, and that's going to be available on every single Apple platform no matter what, and people are going to expect that.
Yeah. And of course, this will be unfortunate for those third-party companies that were providing this sort of cross-platform check-in, like a subscription backend before. But that's what happens when you're building on top of an Apple platform to fix one of the Apple limitations or shortcomings. It is, you always got to keep in mind that the risk of being Sherlocked and your whole business model going away is always very high. So it's unfortunate, but it comes with the territory, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Right. And I think for a lot of those companies, it was one service that they offer and not the full array of services, because a lot of these companies are also doing app store optimization and other things. So hopefully it doesn't mean the end of any of them.
So some of the takeaways for this entire discussion about subscriptions, I think what I want to mention is the fact that for a long time we thought that it's just Mac developers who had the sort of the freedom and the flexibility of trying different pricing models, trying different purchase options. But I think what we've seen so far is that is now that kind of experimentation is now possible on iOS as well, with in-app purchases and subscriptions and different pricing tiers for different levels of subscriptions, and of course paid upfront, and offering discounts for legacy users. There's a lot of things that developers can actually do, and so I think it's important that developers go beyond this old mindset of no, it's just Mac developers that can try a bunch of different things. Because go to App Store Connect in your developer profile and see all the options that you have for different and subscription discounts if you want to allow an old user to come back, or maybe offer a discount for people who subscribe for a long time. There's a lot of hidden settings and things that you can try, and I think that pricing flexibility and offering multiple options is really important these days if you want to differentiate in this market.
Yeah, I remember the good old days, Federico, when at the end of any review it just said, this app is available on the App Store for X. That is no longer true. There are a lot of options, and there's a little more explaining that we end up doing as a result. And I think it pays to try to keep that simple, but it's nice that there's room for experimentation.
What else do I want to mention? Let me see. Oh yeah, I mean, of course, if possible, don't announce your switch to subscriptions out of the blue. Provide some communication to customers beforehand. That doesn't mean that you should spoil your entire launch months in advance, but especially, again, you have to be realistic. A lot of people have opinions and feelings about subscriptions. So the more you can do to take action beforehand on that, to preemptively announce, look, this is what our business looks like, this is what we're going to do. I think that's important. I think customers appreciate that. I think it creates a different kind of conversation that can, you can spend a couple of months talking about it, discussing it with customers, gauging their reactions. And when the launch day comes, you won't usually, and I mean, we've seen with MindNode, we've seen with OmniFocus, you get that whole backlash, that whole conversation, maybe not the whole backlash, but at least you get part of that conversation out of the way so that you can actually focus on providing value to your customers who want to subscribe. I think it's really important that you communicate to people, that you explain things clearly and plainly and simply so that everybody understands. Again, don't just pop out on a Friday evening with a Medium post that says, we're going to use subscriptions now, because that will not go well.
Right. No, it absolutely will not. And, I think it helps to pair that message with the roadmap that you talked about, that there's, in that update that brings the subscription, there's something to entice people to subscribe, some new big feature that they're going to get for doing that, and also a sense for what's coming down the road as well. Because I think Fantastical did a really good job of that, showing what the new features were, which a lot of people were willing to pay for, you and me included. But one thing that I don't think they did quite as well is they didn't telegraph where things were going in the future. And I think the relationship with the customer changes once you have a subscription. They feel more invested in what they're going to get for their money every month or every year. And I think it helps to provide a sense for that, even if you're not able to give like hard deadlines as to when these things are coming, but a general sense for the kind of problems and features that are going to be tackled next goes a long way.
And lastly, I want to mention, and maybe this is obvious, but I feel like it gets ignored far too often from a lot of developers. You got to show your customers why a subscription is needed. And I know that this may seem obvious, but you need to show with regular updates, with regular communication. A subscription is a recurring payment method. And especially when people pay monthly, you need to show them the value of their subscriptions. And just being able to say, if you pay, you can use the app, may not be enough. It is necessary to show that it's an ongoing development type of deal, that in exchange for money coming from users every month or every 6 months or every year, your product is in active development, is alive and well, and you're working on new features, you're working on bug fixes. I think this should be obvious for a lot of developers, but I think it's important to mention it. It's important for people to see the actual value that they're getting, not just because they get to use the app, but because they know that the developer behind the app that is asking for a subscription is actually working on the app and is maintaining the app and is using new technologies and bugs are being fixed and all of that. I think it's important.
Yeah, I think Ulysses is a very good example of that, because they explained very clearly how they were going to use subscription revenue to allow them, instead of doing, I think Ulysses at one point was on kind of like a yearly release schedule for really big new features. And they said, look, we're going to be able to do features much more regularly. And they have. They've proven it out. They've written about them. You can go find them on the web. And I think that that's a really good model to kind of follow. Well, Federico, I think it's a really good conversation about subscriptions this week. I'm glad we talked about it. It's been a long time since we covered it before, and it's been kind of an ongoing conversation in the community the last several weeks, especially since Fantastical came out, and it's nice to kind of get our perspectives out there. I want to thank our two sponsors again. That's Direct Mail and Indeed. course, you can find me and Federico over at macstories.net and at Club Mac Stories. And you can find Federico on Twitter and Instagram. He's at Viticci. That's VITICCI. And I'm at John Voorhees. JOHNVOORHWS. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.